All right, guys, we're on to our second session. I want to just say, Mike, I enjoyed it. I'll have to re-go through it again, but thoroughly you scrambled my brains, and I know some of you are sitting here and saying, really, Derek, it was the easiest thing on earth. But I love a challenge. It is absolutely wonderful having everybody. Can we say a short prayer together before we let Mike speak some more and we can start again? Our Holy Father, oh Father, what a privilege it is to be in your presence every day. What a joy it is, Father, to call on your name and to acknowledge, Father, that you are the creator of this universe. Father, thank you for Mike, his humility, his love, his passion. And Father, him digging into theories, Father, that for so long has captivated the hearts of so many wonderful, wonderful people. Thank you, Lord, that our humility and our desire for folk to know you eclipses our desire to win an argument, our desire to have them have the greatest gift on earth, and that's a relationship with you, is our most important aim and our desire for every single person as you have. So, Father, we pray that you'll bless Mike, and thank you so much for him and Dorian and the team for being here today so that we can share and talk about and think about these wonderful physical aspects, Father, that so often we don't look at intrusively as we maybe should. Pray that you bless him. Thank you for his family that loan him to us. May you be glorified in everything that is said and done in Jesus' name. Amen.
All right, well, thank you again for being here today. I did want to compliment again your congregation. I tried to deny both a muffin and a cup of coffee at the start of the break, and I was brought both a muffin and a cup of coffee. So again, you are very hospitable to your guests, and again, that's one of many things. Also, what was mentioned to me that if you do have a question, they do actually have a microphone that they can bring you to. But otherwise, I'll do my best to repeat the question. But any questions or comments or clarifications anyone would like to make on what we've talked about so far today? Yes?
Why do scientists seem to be ignoring the law of biogenesis?
Okay, the question was why do scientists seem to be ignoring the law of biogenesis? And so again, that's one I think most scientists, and this is just my experience, it's, for example, I work with, work at NASA at the moment, and I work for, and most of the people I work with believe in God, believe in the Bible. But if you go out on the media, certainly, a lot of TV shows, a lot of the anti-Christian magazines, they try to give this impression that, scientists don't believe in God. That hasn't been my experience. Now, have had some coworkers that are very, they're I won't say intimidated, but they're nervous about letting people know they believe in God. They'll literally, so it's just, but in general, so I think I can't, just in answer to the question, I can't imagine anyone, even the most devout atheist, looking at life and not realizing that God created life. Now, I think a devout atheist will look at life, and especially everything we know about life now, and maybe he's so committed to being against God, like we talked about Fred Hoyle, just he's so committed to being an atheist that he said, wow, this is going to be even harder than I thought. I mean, in other words, he's trying to figure out a way that could make itself but I think if someone is looking at it scientifically, it is a law. I mean, it's the law of biogenesis. So I mean, it's a scientific law that life comes from life, and so it's an excellent question. But I think it's, I think out in public, of course, the atheists they'll just go right along with that. Well, 3.8. I think right now they're saying 3.8 billion years ago life made itself, and so boy, when they're out talking their religion, and a lot of them again have degrees. They have scientific credentials. I mean, they won't flinch, but boy, if they really had to, because again, they know that same question we asked. I mean, how can they with a straight face claim that they're being scientific when they say something made itself that we can't, we can't make, getting hundreds of billions of dollars, smartest PhDs, best labs. So they can't say that's scientific. Now they can say, which they often do, that but that's still what they believe, and God gives us the right to choose. God lets us choose where we put our faith. But it's, but yeah, scientifically, I mean, again, it's just, I'll say excellent question. But I think the only part was that many more scientists believe in God, scientists and engineers, than the media will let on, or just and I want, again, I have to be careful what terms, I don't want to generalize, but just just the general impression that our society is trying to create, and so many more scientists and engineers believe in God than what would be let on. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, so we'll talk about that. We might get to it before lunch, but for sure after lunch, because that's that's one of the weird things about the Big Bang is, well, I'll wait until we get the quote, but yeah, it's exactly that. It's the Boltzmann brain idea, and it's basically saying the probability of a universe that's this finely tuned popping into existence is extremely small compared to the probability of just a brain popping into existence. And it's actually on Wikipedia. I think people are getting funding to study that. They call it the problem because it's another reason against the Big Bang, against that whole idea. But yeah, so it's basically the idea would be that from my perspective, I think you're here. I think I'm having a great trip. I think but you're really not. I'm just this brain that popped into existence, and I'll be vanishing like that. And it's strange. But I'll just give a quote. Have a couple of quotes. I think I got one off of Wikipedia just a few months ago. And I'm not quoting Wikipedia because it's a great source. I'm just saying this is what a lot of people are seeing. So. Oh, okay. Oh, okay. Oh, okay. Was that okay? Okay. Oh, that's one. Yeah. Well, it's actually, and then you go into the science fiction. I think it's Guardians of the Galaxy and Ego. Okay, I don't want to get into science fiction movies, but anyway, I think he's a Boltzmann brain, if I was reading between the lines right. I wasn't, again, it's the same thing. You're supposed to just forget about thinking and enjoy the movie, but I was trying to think, okay, is that what he, but anyway, so it was but yeah. So no, good comment, good question. Yeah.
At the end of today, now that we know this, what would you think, and you might not answer, now that we know this, you might not want to answer it now, but at the end, what do you think can we do with this information, especially within our congregations and within our homes?
Okay, I think just one of the things just in general is, I guess they call it Christian evidences, so realize it's very important. And the only reason I say that is because more and more people are growing up outside the church, and so it started at a very early age. Some congregations now, they're even having talks like this, at the right level, even down to like third grade, second grade, because that's when children start to notice what they're hearing in society, and they start getting bombarded. So, but it's actually very important. I mentioned that when we were searching for the truth, it took us a long time, and it was someone realizing that it was important to say it's not what they thought, it's what the Bible says. And so this is maybe analogous if you've grown up inside the church, or you're turn itself into an animal, but that's what people are being brainwashed into believing. So maybe the other one is, and it's also at a very young age. Don't wait until high school or college to start teaching it. Just at a very, because some of these are very obvious. You can point to a child has an electronic toy, and just say, well, is that a fancy toy? And they'll say, oh, yeah, it's great. It does this and this and this and this. And says, well, could it have just made itself? And they'll look at you funny, so be careful how you phrase it, But and then say, well, God's the simplest life, simplest of God's creation is just much more. And they'll understand it. It's not, but just plant this. And then the one that was hard when our children were younger is, letting them. It's that balance. We want them to respect authority. We want them to respect adults, but have them realize that there's going to be some adults out there that are trying to deceive them, and that's so hard because on the one hand you're saying you always respect your teachers, always respect your, but it's just a hard one. So it depends on the child, but just let them know that yes, they are to respect authority, they are to respect their teachers, other adults, but there are going to be some that will actually be trying to deceive them, and so then just go back and saying they need to be like the Bereans. If they hear something, talk to us as their parents, or talk our grandparents, or or check for themselves to see if it's consistent with the Bible. So just along those lines, I guess I'd say just if anything, first of all, I want everybody to be 100% confident talking about this. And so again, we're we have until Tuesday afternoon, and we will be happy to stay at the building the entire time. So please don't. Yeah, so please don't leave here with any questions, and then after that, take it seriously, and and just make sure to communicate that and keep it important. So excellent question, excellent point. Yeah.
I know someone that believes, you mentioned aliens earlier on, and I know someone that follows a huge conspiracy theory about aliens, and the one conversation that we had was that for Christians, it's going to be one of the most difficult things to realize that there's no God, because there's actually alien beings that's much higher than us that's actually ruling the world, and there's a huge following for that.
Okay.
So and to try and logically speak to someone like that is very difficult.
Yeah.
Bringing in biblical terminology that cut you down to the bone. And they don't even want to listen to you, no matter how patient you are, no matter how loving you are towards them. It's just, that's brainwashed completely.
Uh-huh.
And to answer to your question you were asking, so chatting to those kind of people, I don't know, it's going to take a very long time. That's what I'm saying. Because I have encountered that over many years with this specific individual.
But you're planting the seed, and again, they're probably doing the poker face, letting you think you have any, and if you get close to striking a nerve, they'll, like you say, they'll shut you. But again, it's still, there aren't aliens, but it's like you say, well, even if there were aliens, who made the aliens? That's a good question. And then it really comes down to, how did the universe that the aliens are supposedly flying around in, how did that universe get created? And then maybe the free will. But again, like you say, you're probably, I think I maybe know the type personality you're talking about, and so you'll have to do that like half a sentence at a time over a period of weeks. But So, excellent question. Thank you. Okay, so we'll go ahead and go through. So again, what we're talking about is just this idea that we know life can't make itself. We know bacteria can't make itself, and so between free will and life not making itself, and so we have the evidences again that hopefully can be used to get someone to objectively consider the Bible, and then so now we're talking about this idea that maybe that somehow through mutations and natural selection, maybe this bacteria could somehow turn itself into all the other life that we see around us. Well, that's, again, goes against true science. And so what we're going to do now is we'll go through like some of the more popular examples, or just a couple that are given for evolution, and show they just have nothing to do with evolution. And so this first one, this was the idea of peppered moths, and this was in, I think, all of the biology textbooks until the early 2000s. Now they're starting to talk about like beak sizes in Darwin's finches, but it's the same thing. Okay, so it's the same basic example that has nothing to do with evolution. And so in the case of the peppered moth, back in the 1850s, and these were basically a moth population around London, and there's two types. You have the typiciform on the left and the carbonariiform on the right. And so again, this is the flagship example. This was used as the example for evolution. So that's why we're talking about moths, just because this was an example. But the finches, it's the same thing. So so that typica form, they had it's like a birch tree or aspen tree. I'm not sure. I know you have. I've seen equivalent trees here. They're kind of like a light bark with a little bit of dark bark. I'm not sure what exact type they are here, but they. But you see that typica form, you can imagine. Okay, if it's sitting on that kind of a bark, it's going to be very well camouflaged. And and the idea was, so a bird flying along, it's looking for something to eat. Oh, it's not going to be able to see that moth because it's camouflaged against the bark. But they had that carbonaria form that's very dark. And so if that carbonaria form was sitting on that same tree bark, well, it's going to show up. The birds are going to get used to it. They spot this dark triangle there, and they eat that form. And so about over 95% of the moths were that typica form. Less than 5% were that carbonaria form. But then the Industrial Revolution occurred, and they started burning a lot of wood, a lot of coal, a lot of soot starts going up in the air. Well, the tree bark actually turned dark. It was so polluted. And but now you have the dark tree bark, and so what would happen? Well, now that typica form, it's got some light markings on it, so the bird's flying along, and it's going to show up. It's not going to be as well camouflaged. That carbonaria form, though, it just blends in perfect because now the tree bark is dark, and so it blends in. And so sure enough, the population density switched. Now you have, there's less than 5% of the typica form, more than 95% of the carbonaria form. About 1950s, they put scrubbers on the smokestacks, the air gets cleaned up, the tree bark goes back to normal, population density flips back. Now you're back to over 95% being the typica form, less than 5% the carbonaria form. And so that's touted as proof of evolution. Evolution in action. They have all kinds of great descriptors for it. But does everybody, based on our discussion so far, does everybody see why that has absolutely nothing to do with evolution? Absolutely. Yeah. So nothing to do with evolution because the information, the genetic information needed for the typica form was always there. The genetic information for the carbonaria form was always there, and there was no new genetic information created. So flagship example, all the textbooks had, you don't know how many people were deceived by it. Absolutely nothing to do with evolution.
What about the birds?
The birds, yeah, we didn't track the birds. Hopefully they were well fed the entire time, but, but I don't know. But yeah, yep. Okay. Then another one is this idea that bacteria are evolving resistance to antibiotics. Now, bacteria are developing resistance to antibiotics, and so this is a very important challenge, but it's the way they develop that resistance either has nothing to do with evolution or it's actually the opposite of evolution. And so this is interesting. We'll talk more later, but the belief in evolution, really this commitment to atheism, is actually holding science back. And we'll show many areas where it's hurt true science. So it hurts us not just spiritually, but also hurts us physically. And so this is one area where we need to make sure that we're allowed to be very honest. In other words, true science has to be allowed because this is it's actually a very important area. It's a very serious problem that these bacteria are developing resistance to antibiotics. And so far, at least what I've seen, is we are able to use true science. But that true science shows that bacteria developing resistance to antibiotics, again, either has nothing to do with evolution, or in some cases, it's actually the opposite of evolution. So I'll give an example. Suppose I'm infected with a bacteria, and I take an antibiotic, and that antibiotic kills 999 out of 1,000 bacteria. Okay, so that's a fantastic antibiotic. But if my immune system doesn't kill that one remaining bacteria, and that remaining bacteria recolonizes my body, well, now I'm infected with an antibiotic-resistant strain of bacteria. Okay, but it had nothing to do with evolution because the information to resist the antibiotic was always there. Okay, see that? So it's not, it's just, I am now infected with an antibiotic-resistant strain of bacteria, but the information to resist the antibiotic was always in the genome. A second way that bacteria develop resistance to antibiotics is it's called plasmid transfer. And basically, if two bacteria are close to each other, they can actually exchange small loops of DNA. And suppose there's a harmless bacteria. If we won't have much time to talk about it today, but we actually have, many people say, more bacteria cells living in our digestive systems than human cells. Okay, so it's kind of, whatever to think about. But they and so there's a lot of very beneficial bacteria. Well, some of those beneficial bacteria have a resistance to an antibiotic, but if they get in close proximity with a harmful bacteria and exchange basically a little loop of DNA, now the harmful bacteria can be resistant to antibiotics. Okay, and so that's why one of the ways they're trying to combat that now is they really control like waste streams coming out of hospitals and things. There's certain ways that we're trying to address that problem. But again, nothing to do with evolution, because the information to resist the antibiotic was always in the genome. So no new information created. The third way bacteria are developing resistance to antibiotics is actually an information loss. And so, for example, you can have a antibiotic that's designed to look like a nutrient that the bacteria ingests. And so the bacteria ingests this, what it thinks is a nutrient. It's actually the antibiotic, and it kills the bacteria. But say a bacteria has a mutation where it can no longer ingest that nutrient. Okay, so it's a loss of information. In that case, it would typically be harmful to the bacteria because that's one less nutrient that it can ingest. But it's a loss of information. But if it can't ingest that nutrient anymore, it also can't ingest the antibiotic. So if it's in a large population of bacteria, it's actually weaker, it has less information, but then that large population of bacteria is being treated by an antibiotic, it won't ingest the antibiotic, it will survive, the other bacteria get killed. So it's the opposite of evolution, but it causes the it leads to resistance to the antibiotics. Okay, you also have control genes. Basically, it's a bacteria. They'll have a control gene that has them produce, say, a certain amount of enzymes that they're just good for the bacteria. It helps the bacteria survive. Well, sometimes they'll lose a control gene. It's a loss of information. And so they lose this control. They're just producing huge amounts of this enzyme. So it's a waste of energy. They're weaker than other bacteria. That's one of the reasons doctors now try to get people that have a bacterial infection. They try to get them out of the hospital as quickly as possible, because just the natural bacteria will tend to kill the antibiotic-resistant bacteria. In other words, the natural bacteria tend to be stronger than the antibiotic-resistant bacteria for this very reason. But in this case, they have a bacteria that lost a control gene. It's just making an incredible amounts of a certain enzyme. So normally it's a waste of energy. It's weaker. But say that enzyme makes it resistant to an antibiotic. And sometimes, like in the case of penicillin, there can be, it can be like an enzyme that makes the bacteria resistant to penicillin. Well, now all of a sudden, even though it's a loss of information, it was the opposite of evolution. If it's with a bunch of other bacteria, they're infecting somebody, that person takes that antibiotic, it will survive. The others will die. So bacteria are developing resistance to antibiotics. It's an important problem. It's really important that we keep allowing true science to be applied and we don't give in to atheism or fake science in dealing with that problem. But in three ways that we develop antibiotic-resistant strains of bacteria. 2 ways have nothing to do with evolution. The information was always in the genome. The third way, it's actually the opposite of evolution. You lose genetic information, but that loss of information has actually made the bacteria resistant to the antibiotic. Okay, so that was, in the U.S. we call them elevator speeches. Where you try to, maybe life from non-life, you can get by between, the first and the 10th floor. This would be like a 1,000-story building for that one. So, any questions, comments? Is that kind of clear?
Mike,
Yeah.
One of the things that always puzzled me, you mentioned that a lot of people that had been atheists and Darwinists has now moved toward almost, and I think just 2 names pop in my mind. I think it is Michael Behe
Okay.
and Stephen Mayer.
Okay.
With the, I think it is irreducible complexity.
Okay, right.
You know the theory. And I'm not quite sure if that was one of the pictures with the flagellum.
Oh, okay.
The whole theory around that. You mentioned also that there was, it's not popular to speak about it, but Michael B. is actually persecuted because he's not holding the Darwinist line.
Yep.
So, just quite sad,
Yeah, it's...
Because true science should not be afraid of being interrogated.
Exactly, yeah. Yep. Yeah, it's the comment was just there are a lot of people that have moved from being atheists to being intelligent design, and again, hopefully we as the church, we need to, we really need to encourage them to keep searching and come to the truth. But he also did mention that they were being, a lot of them were being persecuted, for doing that, and so that's that's just that can be a problem. So it's, but again, it's all things work together for good. I've been blessed to be in a situation I've never felt persecuted. So it's,
Absolutely. Bless you.
okay. So and then many other examples. We talked briefly about dogs, but you have a.
I just want to be, evolution is the addition of information or knowledge.
In this case, correct,
And adaptation is just taking what you have. Could you just discuss the difference between adaptation and evolution?
Right, okay. No, that's very good. So adaptation, the question was the difference between adaptation and evolution. So adaptation is either information neutral, and so that would be like the peppered moths. You could say the peppered moths adapted, so if the tree barks were dark, most of the population was dark. If the tree bark was light, most of the population of the moth had that lighter color. So that's an adaptation, but it's information neutral. With the bacteria, it was, again, either information neutral or loss of information. But another adaptation could be, say, a population of dogs went into the Arctic. Then the dogs, the genetic information was all there. But there will be some dogs, again, shortly after the flood, after the dogs came off of the ark, the pair of dogs, there might have been some dogs that were born that were had short hair and were very small. Well, they're not going to be as adept at living in the Arctic as, say, a large dog with long fur and more insulation on the paws. So that would be an adaptation. But again, all that information was there. So the adaptation, there's no new genetic information created, and often there's a loss of genetic information. So that was back to the kind of financial analogy, with the loss of money. Evolution requires a gain of information, and it's just a huge difference. It's a sign change. It's just completely different. You'd expect with the information in the genome, you'd expect adaptation, just based on all of that information in the genome at the start. But that's, again, either going to be neutral or losing information. Evolution somehow requires new information be created. So it's not, I don't want, it's completely different. There's no similarity. There's literally no similarity between, it's just it's just different. So excellent question. So is that part clear? That's really the whole idea, is we see changes. Because there's some of the textbooks in the United States, the teacher's edition will say, just if you have a child that's questioning evolution, just send them down to the pet store and ask them if there's any new breeds of dogs or cats. Tell them a new breed of dog or cat is change, and evolution is change, therefore that proves evolution. Well, that's completely misleading. It is completely deceitful, craftiness, it's because that new breed of dog or cat was made by removing genetic information. In other words, if say I wanted to develop a breed of small dogs, the way you develop that breed of small dogs is you get rid of all the information for big dogs. You don't create any new information. You just get rid of the information for big dogs, you end up with small dogs. It's simplified, but that's essentially what you're doing. You're not, new breed of dog or cat, you never create new information. You always develop that breed by removing genetic information. And that's actually why a lot of purebred dogs or horses, any purebred, they actually have genetic problems because we've gotten rid of genetic information that was needed to keep that animal healthy in the process of trying to develop a certain breed. So again, can't stress, that's kind of the key for this section is as when we see adaptations, we see new breeds of dogs and cats, we see that's nothing to do with evolution, because you're either the same information or you're losing information. Evolution requires new information be created. So excellent. Thank you for that question. Yeah.
I just want to say, I know a lot of people, when we speak about evolution, and we say we don't believe in evolution the way that it's
Right.
portrayed, they tend to think that we don't see animals being adaptive, we
Right.
don't see things changing, we just say, no, that can't be true. But if we say the way that God created the cat, how it's changed and adapted over time,
Right.
yes, it's evolving, but the building blocks are there already. So
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, so the original, a lot of people think the original created kinds were at the family level. You see have kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. So it looks like the original creation was at the, a lot of people think at the family level, roughly. It can depend, because that's a man-made classification system. So yeah, if you, within the dog family, again, you can get everything from Great Danes to Chihuahuas, but that could all come from a single pair of dogs. And but that's an important point. We don't want to oversimplify what we're saying, because we want the people to understand us, but sometimes we accidentally oversimplify. And so we should go ahead and say, no, I mean, it sounds, I don't say geeky, but, at the risk of sounding too technical, just go ahead and say, no, we know, we just, how to phrase it? Yeah, we know new genetic information isn't being created, but certainly within God's creation, the genetic information that was available, we expect to see this adaptation. And then they'll probably look at you funny, but still, it's, just get it out there. No, we'll go as much technical detail as you want on this. Yeah.
In our circles, we use the word microevolution more as what we see in dogs.
Right.
Macroevolution we more use for the theory of evolution.
Right. And they're totally different. And that's what bothers me, because because when you say microevolution, it implies lots of micro equals macro. But you're right, that's the term that's used. But why I think it's intentionally deceptive is because just linguistically, lots of micro leads to macro. And that's not what we're seeing. And so they should have a different word for it. And I think they purposely don't have a different word for it. So they should, if they wanted to be accurate, they'd say information neutral or losing changes versus information gaining changes. And there'd be zero information gaining changes. But but that's an excellent point. Yeah, had a question back there. Yes. Oh no. Okay. Oh, sorry. Okay. Yeah. Don't be afraid to move. I mean, I don't want to miss a question, but don't feel like you have to do this either. So okay. Okay. Sorry. So okay. All right. Well, let's we'll keep going. So I'm going to give one final analogy on this, and so this is really what an analogy for evolution. Because you have mutations and natural selection. That's actually a really good analogy. It's a book. J.C. Sanford. He was a professor at Cornell University, a geneticist, and he just over time went from being, he basically became very good at pointing out just how everything we see about evolution is that it's false. And so, and I can't remember if he used this exact analogy, but he uses similar ones. But the idea was, okay, so you want to talk about mutations and natural selection. So I want everybody to just kind of imagine the perfect automobile. Okay, so imagine the perfect automobile. And then, okay, so you have the perfect automobile. So you want to write the manual for manufacturing that perfect automobile. Okay, so now you got the perfect manual for making the perfect automobile. Go ahead and make 1,000 copies of that manual. Okay, but before you make an automobile, just change 100 words in each manual. Okay, so you got 1,000 copies of this perfect manual, but change 100 words in each manual. Make them different words. So you just kind of call it your word processor. Just change 100 words in each manual, and then go ahead and make 1,500 cars. Okay, so you had this 1,000 manuals. They started out perfect. You changed 100 words in each manual. They could have been different words in each manual. Make 1,500 cars. Okay, so what are the cars going to look like? Are they going to be perfect? No, they won't be perfect. But they'll all have different changes, right? And so some of the cars, maybe the rearview mirror is a little bigger than you wanted it. You didn't need it that big, and it's kind of blocking bed. Okay, but I can live with that. Okay, so you keep that one. But what if one of your cars has the engine up on the roof? Okay, you're like, well, I can't live with that. Okay, so of those 1,500 cars you made, go ahead and keep the 1,000 you liked the best, and get rid of the 500 that they're just I can't deal with that. Okay, so what you just did is you just had mutations where you changed the 100 words, and then you had natural selection where out of the 1,500 cars you kept the 1,000 you liked the best, and you got rid of the 500 you didn't like. Okay, so now repeat the process, okay? So the manuals you used to make the cars that you kept, change another 100 words in each of those manuals, make 1,500 cars, keep the 1,000 you like the best, get rid of the 500 you don't like. So again, you have mutations and natural selection. After you've done that 100 times, you've now changed 10,000 words in each manual. And they're all different words, but you've changed 10,000 words in each manual. And you've, so the question is, how long is it going to take before your car turns into a jet airplane? Okay. Yeah, that's not the direction you're going, right? And in fact, from true science, we know that. What's unfortunately going to happen is eventually you'll have error catastrophe where there's not a single manual left that would make a functioning car. And so that's why I know some of you may be working in chemistry labs. Well, if there's a mutagen, you handle that with special care, because again, we know, mutations. You get into the finer details, but there's not some, you don't want mutations. You don't want to take something that's highly designed and mutate it. When I used to work at Los Alamos National Lab, you would think, well, out there you should be able to put a reactor out in the middle of a field and just get all the people behind like a concrete wall and turn the reactor on and run it. And well, we weren't allowed to do that. And it was a lot of it, they'd call it genetic burden, just because of the plants that would have been near the reactor and the small animals and things, because we knew we'd be mutating them. So in no field of science are mutations considered good. But in the case of evolution, they're saying, oh no, mutation is a natural selection. That'll lead to new species and new this and new. Well, it's nothing what we see. You can use simple analogies to know it doesn't make sense. But that's but again, just maybe one more way to try to explain this to people if they're struggling with the information in the genome and where that information might come from. Okay, so so we'll again, we can talk more at lunch afterwards. But any final questions or comments on this section? Because now we're going to talk about just some of the societal impacts, and then maybe get into a couple of more topics before lunch. But Luke 10:27, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your strength, with all your mind, and your neighbor as yourself. And so this is going to be really important, and I want to introduce what really for the next few minutes is we've got to keep society focused on the spiritual. As Christians, that's what we should be doing anyway, but it's going to be as important now as ever because Christians aren't the only ones that have noticed the genome is degrading. And so if you talk to an atheist that's willing to be really objective with you, they'll say things like, no, compassion is bad. We don't want to be compassionate. We don't want to love people that are less blessed than we are. We don't want to, and they're being, I guess what you say, a consistent atheist. I mean, if they really didn't believe in God, then their focus is 100% on the physical. And as Christians, we know our focus should be 100% on the spiritual. Even when we provide physical benevolence, when we help people physically, it's to encourage them, to become to obey the gospel, to become Christians. And so, but anyway, this is just one of many papers. It says a new paper written by a leading population geneticist shows that human genetic degeneration is a very serious problem. He affirms that the human germline mutation rate is roughly 100 new mutations per person per generation, while the somatic mutation rate is roughly 3 new mutations per cell division. Lynch estimates human fitness is declining 1 to 5% per generation. He has, so wow. So if someone's focused on the physical, and they see this, and generally becomes accepted that we're losing 1 to 5% human fitness every generation, which again, from true science, makes sense when we're seeing the mutations accumulating, what's happening in the genome. If they're focused on the physical, I mean, it's you can start to imagine it could be a pretty horrific response to that, because their first one is, oh, we got to slow that down, and then you can just see how that starts to play out, and so that we'll give some examples of that. So again, we need to stay focused on the spiritual. Again, mentioned we are all unique, and because again these mutations have been accumulating since since Adam sinned, and so that's. But 1 Corinthians 12:17-20 says, if the whole body were an eye, where would be the hearing? If the whole were hearing, where would be the smelling? But now God has set the members, each one of them, in the body just as He pleased, and if they were all one member, where would the body be? But now indeed there are many members, yet one body. And so, again, talked about the non-Christian solutions to this problem are frankly frightening. I mentioned that people are literally talking about we need to go to survival of the fittest. Any kind of compassion is bad. I mean, it's just the exact opposite of what God tells us. They want to now talk about having genetic screening before people are allowed to have children, talk about societal screening before people are allowed to. Because think about it, if someone doesn't believe we have a soul, they don't think we have free will, then they're going to be able to tell, supposedly, how you're going to act based on what your parents, grandparents, great-grandparents did. So again, it's really, some strange ideas that are starting to float. And so you think, well, okay, how serious is this? Well, this was from almost 4 years ago now, but there was, you might not even remember it, but for a few days in the United States, it was presented as good news. And that's what was one of the many things that were so disturbing. But it was presented as good news by a lot of our media that Iceland had eradicated Down syndrome. Because when you first heard that, you're like, wow, how that's, you're thinking they cured Down syndrome, or they did, or what did they do? So you want to read the article. Well, it turned out what they had done is there's technology now, it's about 5 years old, where just from a simple blood sample from the mother, they can determine the genetics of a baby. Okay, and so you think, wow, it's like any other technology. It can be used to do a lot of good, but it can also be used for evil. And so in this case, it was being used for evil because what they would do is if they thought the baby might have Down syndrome, they were putting tremendous pressure on the mother to kill the baby. They would say, they would try to make her feel guilty for having the baby. They would try to threaten her, well, we won't give you any support, if you have that baby. And so apparently, according to these news articles, they had succeeded, and they said there were, that they had eliminated Down syndrome in Iceland. This was a father who wrote a response. This was in the Denver Post. It was, that's just a city in the United States. It says, as the proud father of a wonderful 14-year-old son with Down syndrome, I was horrified at the news of a near eradication of children with Down syndrome in Iceland due to early identification procedures and early termination of pregnancies. It is clear that technology is ahead of understanding of the contribution that children with Down syndrome make to their families and to their communities. Studies show an extremely high happiness rate for families who have children with Down syndrome and also for persons with Down syndrome. And so I was very impressed with the father for writing that letter, because I'm sure he received all kinds of abuse from various people, but it took a lot of courage. But also it's just sad that he had to write the letter, because not only is it sad that I think there's like 8 countries now doing this. Not only was it sad that those countries are doing that, but it's the second paragraph. He had to say that extremely high happiness rate for family. It's like he feels like he's having to justify his son's existence because his son's happy and his son's making his family happy. So this was about 4 years ago. There was also a testimony following that, and this one it's a video is available on YouTube. If you watch, just look under Frank Stevens' testimony, and I can play it. Maybe I'll play it during lunch or something. If people are interested in seeing it. But it's Frank Stevens. So he had Down syndrome, and he testified in front of a committee, shortly following this news. And it's just a really powerful testimony. I won't do it justice just by reading some of his quotes. But again, it says, then he says, I am a man with Down syndrome, and my life is worth living. And I don't know how he's getting to this. I'm trying to think about, because I'm genetically, different. And if someone had decided, oh, well, anybody with, Mike's genetics, we're going to get rid of. Well, I can't imagine standing up in front of a bunch of people and say, hey, I'm good. I'm not good. I'm not good in that respect. It's just, hey, I don't mind living. It's and that's basically what he's having to say. Says, sadly, across the world, a notion is being sold that maybe we don't need research concerning Down syndrome. Some people say prenatal screens will identify Down syndrome in the womb, and those pregnancies will just be terminated. It's hard for me to sit here and say those words. Well, yeah. Because he has Down syndrome. I completely understand that the people pushing this particular final solution are saying that people like me should not exist. That view is deeply prejudiced by an outdated idea of life with Down syndrome. Seriously, I have a great life. Goes on, and he mentions all the good things he's gotten to do, and at the end he says he doesn't feel like he should have to justify his existence. But then he mentions just medical contributions, talks about people with Down syndrome and families with of people with Down syndrome actually tend to be happier. But then this third one, I think that was, this is a very important one. It says, finally, we are the canary in the eugenics coal mine. And of course, that's the one I think people remember. They used to have canaries in coal mines just to monitor the atmosphere. And apparently, if the canary started acting a little strange, you needed to get out of the coal mine. So it was, and so that's, but what he's saying is they're the canary in the eugenics coal mine because, okay, so apparently Iceland and other countries have decided, okay, Down syndrome, we're gonna try to basically kill those babies. And then, okay, well, maybe it was Down syndrome that year. Well, maybe next year it's like 10 genetic differences. Maybe the following year it's 100 genetic differences. Maybe the following year it's 1,000 genetic differences. And so what he's saying is, hey, we have to, this is when societies are going to be making a decision. And that's something that's going to be so important for the church to be out in front of this and just tell people, we don't even think about going down that road. I mean, it's we need to stay focused on the spiritual, because that 1 to 5% loss of fitness and whatever, however people want to phrase it, it totally, from a spiritual perspective, it totally doesn't matter. We need to stay focused on the spiritual. Yeah, you have a question in back?
Yeah, I've just brought something to my mind that my second son, my second child, has rare disease, osteogenesis imperfecta. And when we had our last son, the doctors kind of pushed us that we need to go and have all the tests done so that we can see that he doesn't have, anything like that in genetics or anything. So you just bring me to mind now what the idea was, maybe to push us into, if he's also got something in that way, that we maybe think about eliminating him or something.
Right. Yeah, and unfortunately, that may have been what they were doing. Did everyone hear the question? Okay. Yeah. No, thank you. Thank you for the comment. That's very good. Okay, so it is a serious problem. Now, Ecclesiastes, of course, we're also told there's nothing new under the sun. And so I want to go back about 100 years. And this was before World War II, and we didn't have the same technology, but the same, I guess I'll just say evil thoughts or the same ideas were around. So this is a Hunter's A Civic Biology. This was the most widely used biology textbook in the United States. And so when you go through and read it, he had things in there that were just either they were completely wrong, or they were fake science, or they were just opinion and not science. But again, it was the most widely used biology textbook in the United States for decades. We have a copy from that was used in Detroit public schools. I mean, it was, again, Detroit's one of the larger cities in the United States. And so, but his quote was, he says, if such people were lower animals, we would probably kill them off to prevent them from spreading. Humanity will not allow this. And then, he goes on. But it's the same basic idea. And so unfortunately now this, the fancy, prenatal screening, or, whatever they want to call it, well, that's the same idea, that there's a group of people that think another group of people shouldn't be allowed to survive. And they're using various ways to justify that. Now, of course, what the Bible says about children, Psalm 127, 3-5, behold, children are a heritage from the Lord. The fruit of the womb is a reward. Like arrows in the hand of a warrior, so are the children of one's youth. Happy is the man who has his quiver full of them. They shall not be ashamed, but shall speak with their enemies in the gate. So again, Bible's just, it's just, children are a blessing from God. And we need to, again, as Christians, obviously we realize that, but that's something we need to stress, because again, there's a lot of people in society that are trying to counter this. This is there was an organization, I think it still exists in the United States. It's called Planned Parenthood, and this is a quote from their founder, Margaret Sanger. And up until 3 or 4 years ago, we actually they used to use taxpayer money from basically the tax all the citizens of the United States. They used to fund this organization. And so this was one of the quotes from Margaret Sanger. She says, the most merciful thing that the large family does to one of its infant members is to kill it. Okay, so this is from 1920, but again, you'd think, how could anyone say that? And I don't think anyone really knows. But if you read the rest of her article, she seemed to be 100% focused on the physical. And so, and she had, just no spiritual focus whatsoever, 100% on the physical. She had all kinds of things she would write, like Plan for Peace, talked about an American baby code, but again, you read this, and it's eugenics. It's what, and this was all before World War II. This was in 1932, and the eugenics was, again, the idea of trying to develop a master race, or trying to get a so-called race of humans that was better or superior. And she said, purpose of the American Baby Code shall be to provide for a better distribution of babies, protect society against the propagation and increase of the unfit. No woman shall have the legal right to bear a child, and no man shall have the right to become a father without a permit. And so again, it's so she called that her plan for peace. And of course, I think this is all pre-World War II. So a lot of this kind of thinking, of course, led to World War II. Now this is Charles Darwin, quote. What's interesting about this, and if we ask like how do they keep teaching that life came from non-life when we know that didn't happen? Well, we shouldn't underestimate the power of the atheists, because most people that would make these kinds of statements, they wouldn't, people would stop listening to them. What's the word now? They'll say they would be canceled if they made statements like this. But this is Charles Darwin, and he's still almost deified in many of the U.S. universities and textbooks and museums. It says, at some future period, not very distant as measured by centuries, the civilized races of man will almost certainly exterminate and replace the savage races throughout the world. At the same time, the anthropomorphous apes will no doubt be exterminated. The break between man and his nearest allies, okay, so again, you notice the eloquence. The break between man and his nearest allies. I mean, just his linguistically, he's very, very good, but what he's saying is just evil. I mean, it's wrong, it's fake science, but I think he draws people in because of his, again, just, I'm not sure why. I'm not sure why anyone would follow this, but a lot of people do. Anyway, he says, the break between man and his nearest allies will then be wider, for it will intervene between man and a more civilized state, as we may hope, even than the Caucasian, and some ape as low as a baboon, instead of as now between the Negro or Australian and the gorilla. Okay, so that is about the most racist statement you could imagine. And, of course, it's made by Charles Darwin. You can get copies of the book. It's in The Descent of Man. When the atheists are questioned, again, they talk about craftiness, deceitful scheming. I saw an atheist ask this once, and he said, no, he doesn't even mention race and origin of the species. Okay, well, this is in Descent of Man. This was in Darwin's, a book written by Darwin. So again, see, it would be just like, they don't even mention math in that book. And you're like, yeah, that was the book on English. You see what I mean? So again, it's just, but these are our quotes from Charles Darwin. He also, so he had very low opinion of anyone that wasn't like him. I mean, he's a Caucasian, so of course he's going to say, in that mindset, he's claiming Caucasians are superior. He was a male, so of course males are superior. He says the average mental power of man must be above that of woman, thus man has ultimately become superior to woman in poetry, strength, voice, etc. And he gives many pages. So, but how is he still, why is he so popular? Why is his teaching still being taught in our universe? So we know, fake science, whatever you want to call it, in his books. We also know technically it's wrong, and also we see that his viewpoints are again just wrong. But he's still very, very powerful, very influential. Now, Ernst Haeckel, remember we mentioned he was the one we mentioned this morning earlier that was trying to find a replacement for the Book of Genesis, was trying to look for what he called simple life. The Monera. I won't bother reading this. He had extremely racist quotes in his book also, and this was his history of creation, because again, he thought, for whatever reason that, he was superior, his so-called race was superior. Then, but the problem is people like that was in the mid-1800s. Well, they had a lot of influence on the rest of the world. And so, at this point in time in the United States, a lot of people in the United States, they'd never gone to college. A lot of people hadn't graduated high school. They hadn't traveled a lot. And so the United States, we were influenced by this fake teaching coming out of Europe. And so this was in that same book, most widely used biology textbook in the United States. It says, at the present time there exist upon the earth 5 races or varieties of man, each very different from the other in instincts, social customs, and to an extent in structure. These are the Ethiopian or Negro type, originating in Africa, the Malay or brown race from the islands of the Pacific, the American Indian, the Mongolian or yellow race, including the natives of China, Japan, and the Eskimos, and finally, the highest type of all, the Caucasians. Okay, so we taught that as science. And then people say, well, and we'd gotten it from Darwin and Haeckel, and then people say, well, wow, why did America have such a huge problem with racism? Well, yeah, we were teaching generations of children that it was scientific. And so again, that's the spiritual damage of fake science, just then societal and physical, but just this whole idea of evolution and atheism is just damaging across the board. And then of course, Margaret Sanger, a very racist. I mean, some of this stuff. This was in her Woman, Morality, and Birth Control. Okay, so she's trying to talk about morality, and the quote says, "We don't want the word to go out that we want to exterminate the Negro population," and she actually puts that in writing. Okay, and so she talks about this. So you can kind of see where that was going. This was all before World War II. And then of course Adolf Hitler, and I don't know all the reasons Adolf Hitler was able to rise to power, but he certainly talked a lot about master races and how some races hadn't evolved into being humans yet, and talked about how nature was against the so-called races, and so anyway, but you compare these two quotes. This is a Margaret Sanger quote. We should apply a stern and rigid policy of sterilization and segregation to that grade of population whose progeny is tainted or whose inheritance is such that objectionable traits may be transmitted to offspring. And Adolf Hitler, if nature does not wish that weaker individuals should mate with a stronger, she wishes even less that a superior race should intermingle with an inferior one, because in such cases, all her efforts throughout hundreds of thousands of years to establish an evolutionary higher stage of being may thus be rendered futile. So he was trying to use fake science to justify his views, and so was Margaret Sanger. But it's so this was 100 years ago, and the way it ties back is again now with Iceland and other countries with this genetic screening and talks of who should be allowed to have children, and unfortunately it sounds like it's becoming more widespread. It's because obviously after World War II this thinking became very unpopular. People said, "Oh, I can't believe we ever believed that. We should never have done that," and they were absolutely right. Problem is, it's starting to come back, and so that's something that as Christians we. And then of course we go to the Bible. Acts 17:26, and he has made from one blood every nation of man to dwell on all the face of the earth, and has determined their pre-appointed times and the boundaries of their dwellings. Genesis 1:27, so God created man in his own image, in the image of God he created him, male and female he created them. So again, Bible's very clear. There's no such thing as races. And the good news is, again, true science has caught up probably about 10 years ago after we knew additional studies of DNA and genetics, and now you have even a lot of atheists who are saying, okay, there's no such thing as races. And they're absolutely right. Well, the Bible said that all along. And so again, true science eventually catches up with the Bible. But in the meantime, because 100 years ago, you talk to someone about Adam and Eve, and their argument would be, well, no, look at how different we all are. How could we have all descended from a single man and a single woman? Well, back to what we've been talking about, we now know from genetics that genetic information for all the physical characteristics of all the people we see on Earth today could have been in Adam and Eve. And then we know, again, from studying mitochondrial DNA, from studying the Y chromosome, the evidence is that we all came from a single man and a single woman. And it gets even better if we look at the actual measured rate of change in mitochondrial DNA. It looks like it happened several thousand years ago. So, not millions or hundreds of thousands of years ago. So again, it's this true science advances. It always confirms the Bible. And I guess the last slide on this particular talk, and then we'll introduce the next topic before lunch. But it says, I think Isaiah 5:20 through 23 is very applicable in many areas, but this area in particular says, "Woe to those who call evil good and good evil, who put darkness for light and light for darkness, who put bitter for sweet and sweet for bitter. Woe to those who are wise in their own eyes and prudent in their own sight. Woe to men mighty at drinking wine, woe to men valiant for mixing intoxicating drink, justify the wicked for a bribe, and take away justice from the righteous man." And so again, I think woe to those who call evil good and good evil. And I think we're going to run into that with this whole idea of genetic screening and focusing on the physical, and only the people with certain genetics should be allowed to have children. And we're seeing all of that. Unfortunately, we should have learned our lesson 100 years ago, but it seems to be coming back. So any questions or comments on what we talked about the last few minutes? Okay, and it is this whole idea. No.
Having read a bit about Darwin and Friedrich Nietzsche, and you can see see how that the ideas kind of played through to Hitler's idea of the preservation of favored races.
Yeah, yeah.
Things like that.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. He just said, yeah, it's amazing how just ideas just move around, and what if they're anti-biblical, just the horribly negative consequences we can have. Had a question here.
So I suppose this may be more of a comment, but it is a question. I heard something about, I'm not sure if it is in the USA, but there was a slave Bible that was also used to keep slave owners in power. Is that something that you've heard about? Because they would often take chunks of the Bible out to justify the whole slave system.
Okay.
I just wanted to know if that's something you're familiar about.
Okay, so I think I'm not deeply familiar with it, but I know almost on any topic, people can take parts of the Bible out of context, and try to make it say anything they want it to. So that wouldn't, unfortunately, I wouldn't be at all surprised that someone tried to edit the Bible, to justify evil. So again, we need to. Then that's a very good point. We need to, rightly divide the truth. We need to look at the whole Bible. So excellent comment. Thank you.
Just a question. The evolutionist, why do they assume that humans are the end of evolution? What species is going to evolve from humans after this?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. No, it's. I think to me, it's just evolution. It's just a fundamental tenet of atheism, and so they don't. They know it doesn't work. I don't know if that, but they just want it out there enough so that they can keep being atheists, so they can deny God. Because that would be exactly that. Or where are we seeing? And then unfortunately, people like Adolf Hitler may have actually thought that there was that he could create a master race, or he could. But I think for most of them, they don't talk about. Now, children's cartoons are different. If you ever watch one, and what do we look like in a million years from now? I think my favorite one we were about this tall, and then the rest of us was just all brain. So, but no evidence that that's actually happening. So yeah.
Einstein said, "I don't know with what World War III is going to be fought with, but World War IV is going to be fought with sticks and stones."
Yeah, that could be. Yeah, and he was a smart guy. So yeah, I could. Yes.
Evolutionists often point to like geology studies and show that, look, their theory lines up with carbon dating of docks and dock sediment and fossil finds and so on. Are the methods of, like modern methods of carbon dating dock and fossils and so on, are they incorrect in the way they prove that certain rock sediments are millions of years old, and when they find these fossils? I mean, can you comment on that, please? So yes, they are incorrect, and then that's something we'll talk about after lunch, and we'll probably. So again, I'll just say that's an exciting topic, and it's one we can talk about for hours, literally, which is fine. But we'll wait kind of towards the end. But we will definitely talk about that as much as anyone would like, because yes, they are incorrect, both carbon dating and radiometric dating in general. Okay. Yeah.
I just want to ask, as a question, it kind of relates to that. Do you have any idea on how old the Earth is itself?
So it's the Earth is about 6,000 years old. I've seen people say that it's a little, so I think what a lot of people, just in terms of if you're talking to people, a lot of times you say it's less than 10,000 years old, because if it's just a, discussion about the genealogies and things like that, when people will usually come out with 6,000, but some will go to 7,000, So to me, that's not the important one. Is it's less than 10,000 years old, because that's what differentiates the Bible from the. So, but as far as is it, 6,032 years. I mean, there are a lot of people that have some very good discussions on that. I usually don't, I usually just say less than 10,000, but it's probably 6,000 to 7,000. Yeah.
You said that all the genetic material for all the different types of people and different types of animal all exist within one individual. So what causes the changes? What causes there to be such a multitude of changes? And is it purely to do with survival of the fittest? Is it just random? And then in these situations, whatever's been born that is best adapted to that situation will survive? Or is there something else to it that triggers all these different changes?
So we're all descendants of Adam and Eve, but then when we think about it, we're also all descendants of Noah and his wife, and then of course, there's 3 sons and their wives coming off of the ark, and so at the Tower of Babel, you had on the order of 100 families. That's listed in Genesis, and so then. When God confused the languages, different families went to different areas of the earth. And so that's most of the differences we see geographically would be because of which family happened to go to which area. Now, there are we could say, people that are, say, better adapted for living in Europe. So shortly after the flood, evidence that that's also when the Ice Age occurred. So say someone was living in caves, which would have been an excellent place to live in Europe, but very little sunlight, maybe poor diet. So certainly some people would have been more adapted to living in that environment than others. And so that would be kind of the natural selection. Other people, if I lived near the equator, I would be very prone to getting skin cancer. And so so you do have some natural selection, but a lot of it was just where the people groups went would be the differences. And then just within those people groups, just the number of combinations of DNA is just unimaginable. So you have a couple, man and a wife having children. Their own DNA still has just a tremendous amount of information in it, and it's just what combination occurs when they have a baby. And so that's why our children, obviously, when we have children, they look different from each other, and that's just the genetic information within the couple. So a lot of different factors, but probably geographically, the biggest difference was at the Tower of Babel. Excellent question, though. Excellent comment. Okay. So we'll just do 2 more quick topics before lunch, and then we'll move on. Probably we'll try to do the Big Bang and then get into radiometric dating after lunch. 2 real quick. First one is this idea of vestigial structures. Now, this is an example of where belief in atheism, belief in evolution really held us back. It always hurts us spiritually, but it also held us back physically, held back true science. And this was an idea. It was about 1895, there was a German scientist, Wiedersheim, and he said that there were 180 organs and structures in our body that had absolutely no function, okay? So they were just evolutionary leftovers. So he said that, this was evidence for evolution. I have, I think, a quote from him on the next slide. We know that's wrong now, but you can imagine if it was 1895 and you'd heard someone say, hey, this was a organ or structure and it does absolutely nothing. Well, say you were just a brilliant anatomist. You just graduated from college, you loved anatomy, you're top in your class. Would you study one of those 180 organs and structures? No, it'd be a waste of your career, right? And so that was an area, because of this idea trying to push atheism, push evolution, this idea really held back science. Now, it was 2003 before we finally found the last holdout was the appendix. And in 2003, there were dozens of papers published about all the functions of the appendix, especially when we're young. So when we're very young, the appendix helps our immune system and helps us determine what bacteria are good, which ones aren't good. Again, we talked about our digestive system, but 1895 till 2003 until we found that out. So that's how much, again, this idea held us back. But it's still in some of the textbooks. Now, granted, these quotes were from 1998, but some textbooks will talk about a vestigial structure as a structure that's a remnant of an organism's evolutionary path that has no function. That was in 1998. So I mean, it wasn't. And it was by then we knew there were functions for all those organisms and structures. But it was just 5 years before that this whole idea was finally put to rest. And I will mention it still makes some of the very pro-evolution magazines and documentaries. They still mention this. But again, it's been proven false. Now, biblically, we know the functionality of some organs and structures may have degraded since the original perfect creation. But this idea that they're just no function and evolutionary leftovers, I mean, it's just not true. So this was the quote from Wiedersheim. Another quote from a textbook: vestigial structure is a body part that no longer has a function. How is a vestigial body part evidence of evolution? I just mentioned some of these quotes because these are in the teacher's edition, there's one textbook that's used that has several pages about how to convince your students that evolution is true. And one of the books, it's like you want them to look at anything they look at and say, well, how's that evidence for evolution? So I could say like, wow, your choice of carpet color in this church building, how's that evidence for evolution? I mean, just anything. They wanted the students to be trained to try to look at anything at all and say, oh, that's evidence for evolution. So it's really disturbing. And so that's, again, as Christians, why it's so important that we equip our children, our grandchildren, others, just to be aware of how much this is permeating our society. So again, functions have been found for all 180 structures believed to be vestigial only a century ago. Many of these functions are vital. Additional functions are continuing to be identified. So that whole argument's gone away. Again, I only mention it is you'll go into zoos, museums, pick up certain magazines, watch certain documentaries. They'll still mention this from time to time, which is really it's like Ernst Haeckel's Monera. It was 50 years after we knew they were just wrong before it finally stopped getting mentioned. And so this one, it's only been, I guess, 20 years, so it's still being mentioned. But it did slow scientific progress. Again, data and true science are the Christian's friend. I also want to mention junk DNA. The good news is most people never heard of junk DNA. And I think there was so much excitement about DNA, and as we were learning about DNA and we were mapping the genome, that the true scientists, they just ignored that whole idea. Because some people would say, well, 98% of the DNA is just junk. Well, don't bother studying it. And I think the true scientists, Christians and atheists alike, the true scientists ignored them. They just said, no, we're not going to fall for that one again. And so sure enough, this was Richard Dawkins. He wrote a book, again, very vocal atheist. Says what pseudogenes are useful for is embarrassing creationists. It stretches even their creative ingenuity to make up a reason why intelligent designers. So again, very, big words, very eloquent. Literally 3 years after he wrote that, it's published. People still buy that book. People still read that book. It was shown that there's no such thing as pseudogenes. But again, it was a very, just kind of a really, condescending, look at those silly creationists, type of statement that published. And, again, it's probably people still probably buy and read that particular book. And so this is actually a town I'm from. It's a very high-tech town in Huntsville, Alabama. We have a Hudson Alpha. It's a consortium of biotech firms that's in our town. And so this was an article in our newspaper back in 2012. It says, vast parts of the human genome thought to be junk DNA, which again, no true scientist ever thought it was junk, are really filled with millions of cellular switches helping choreograph the roles genes play in human life and disease, scientists said today. Researchers from 32 laboratories around the world, including Huntsville's Hudson Alpha Institute for Biotechnology, announced a simultaneous publication of 30 scientific papers detailing new discoveries. And so again, this whole idea, true science, again, is the Christian's friend. Ignorance is the friend of the atheist. They try to play on if there's an area that we don't know much about or that's really vague, and we'll try to talk about fossils after lunch too, just something so vague that it can kind of be spun. That's what they focus on. If you get into true science, you get into the details. It always confirms the Bible, and it is a Christian's friend. And this is a classic example. So this whole idea of junk DNA has gone away. And it's even worse when you think about it. If you've ever looking at, say, like a manual for a transmission, literally you got a parts list that's maybe this many pages, and how all the parts go together is about this many pages. And they were saying the junk DNA idea was that the only thing that mattered was the parts list. And you could throw away anything that told basically any of the instructions on how those parts went together. So the whole idea was ridiculous from the start, but it actually gained some traction. Sounds like some people might remember that. Then the final one, and this will just be like 2 charts, and then we'll break for lunch. So vestigial organs, that's Again, it's completely gone, but you will still run into it. So don't be afraid. Don't be surprised if you see it. The last one's homologous structures. Now, this isn't a scientific argument. And what I mean by that is the argument is that it's just opinion. The idea is that, okay, if you took an x-ray of the bones in my arm, you took the x-ray of say the bones in a leg of a dog, there'd be some similarities. And you can go even further. You say, okay, the DNA, this is, again, what God uses to code for physical characteristics in life. You look at the DNA that's used to, say, code for muscle tissue in different kinds of animals. Well, there's similarities. And so it's homologous structures. But the idea is, okay, because we see these similarities, somehow that proves one type of life turned into another type of life. And so it even makes some, supposedly scientific sites. I like this first one just because this was on the website of the Department of Zoology, University of British Columbia in Vancouver. It says, this observation makes little sense for created objects since a creator could mix and match features observed in any organism. Okay, is that a scientific statement? I mean, is that something that a science department should be, right? There's absolutely no science in that at all. I mean, it's even worse. I mean, they're saying that they even know the mind of God. I mean, they know that no sense for created objects, creator could mix and match features observed in any organism. I mean, it's a completely non-scientific statement. But that's now what used to be considered. I guess you say homologous structures. Like Ernst Haeckel used to do things like he'd say, well, we all go through when an embryo is developing, it goes through like a fish stage and a chicken stage, and he had this whole thing made up in his book. It turns out it's actually that's looking at things very vaguely. Obviously, if we study it now that we know about DNA, a human is always a human. A fish is always a fish. A chicken is always a chicken. But it's also, when you think about it, how did God design us? So from a single fertilized egg, we could develop into a human being. Or really how a bird could develop. Well, it turns out a very ingenious engineering design. A very simplistic example would be like one of those puzzles where they say, like do certain things with all these dots without lifting your pencil off the paper. So, I mean, it's just multiply that by like a lot. I mean, it's so ingenious design to turn just a single fertilized egg into any kind of a complex organism. And so that's all we were seeing. But again, humans are always humans. But they would use that as an idea for homologous structures, or somehow as evidence that one kind of animal turned into another. But I think I'll just end on this slide for this session. Is just think about our own personal experience. If you're driving down the road and you turn on the radio and you hear a song you've never heard before, well, a lot of times you have an idea who wrote the song, and the reason is it's the similarities. You have the same notes, you have this, kind of the same theme, the same instruments. If you see a painting, I'm horrible at art, but I know some people that are good at art. They could, you could have a painting across the street, and they could look at the color scheme and just the general everything, and say, oh, that's probably painted by such and such, and a lot of times they're right. But what they know is they're looking at this, the type, maybe the theme or the types of colors, of brightness, all the things they would look at. So, but again, it's when we see similarities, it's because it's the same creator. And that's our experience. The same creator, you have similarities. And so we expect there to be physical similarities amongst all life because God created all life. But the important thing is that only people are created in God's image. And that's the key. Genesis 1, 26 and 27, people are created in God's image. Animals aren't. And so we are created in God's spiritual image. And that's, again, the focus is on the spiritual. And so we see some physical similarities. Well, that's exactly what we expect because God created all life. But those physical similarities don't matter. It's the spiritual difference that matters. And again, from Genesis 1, 26 and 27, we know that people are created in God's image. And so I guess this session, again, we talked about information in the genome, but then just right at the end, then not just the physical evidence, but also the societal and spiritual importance that we address that. And then also very quickly, of course, we talked about vestigial structures, homologous structures. So again, please feel free to ask questions during lunch or any time during the day. But I think we'll go ahead and wrap up with this slide for now. So thank you for your attention.